Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Mysteries Unknown. Tonight I got a really cool podcast for you. I've got Russ on the line with me, and Russ has had 4 separate encounters. Some of these are Class A encounters over the years. One of them starting was a kid, and another one happened right here in Arkansas. So I'm going to let Russ jump right into it, but as always, if you've got a story, a mystery that you want to talk about, you can reach me by email at video@jscreativear.com. Russ, welcome to the show.
Thank you for reaching out. My first encounter happened when I was 4 years old. I was with my dad. My dad was kind of a Renaissance man from the backwoods of Florida. And that's important later on in the story because he tells me things. And I saw my first Bigfoot in Wichita Falls, Texas area. He was stationed at Shepherd Air Force Base. And he ran a diner, and he had many, many friends. And his favorite thing to do was, here's a man that worked the Air Force, worked Air Force all day long, came and worked a diner. And he loved to fish and hunt. That was his major things of enjoyment. So one evening, one of his buddies that had a 500-acre ranch comes in and says, "Hey, you want to go fishing tonight?" So, of course, once I heard, I had to go because I wanted to be with my dad and I loved sitting out. So we went out to this guy's ranch, and he had Brahma bulls and Brahma cattle. So we're sitting there in the middle of the night. They'd set me up a little fire to keep warm with, and they'd fish one of the cattle ponds type. Here's a good-sized pond. And all of a sudden, I heard... We heard the Brahmas just start baying and hollering, and then we could hear them coming. So my dad grabbed me up real quick and stuck me in the back of the truck, and told me just to stay down. Well, I didn't stay down, and what happened was this creature was behind the Brahmas chasing, and this wasn't a typical, what you see like a patty Bigfoot. There was bulk to it, but it was also very slim. It was built out. It had a V-frame chest, so to speak. So I don't know if it was young, if it was a different type, and I think there are different types out there. And so I peered my little eyes across the top, and him and his buddy Joe grabbed their weapons. And even at the age of 4 years old, I knew what a weapon was. A weapon was for 2 things, hunting and protection. Well, I figured out real quick this wasn't a hunting opportunity, we were fishing. And when they grabbed their weapons, my dad had a 10-gauge Ithaca. And that thing was powerful, but and Joe had a pistol. And they didn't shoot at it, they shot up in the air. And it stopped, and I can still see the fire coming out of my dad's shotgun to this day. And it stopped, and they started hollering at it. Well, at that point, they lowered their weapons on it. So the next move was going to be they were going to have to start shooting it. And it was that close. It was the Brahmas that ran by, talk about a thundering herd. I can't remember if it was 10, 8, 12, how many Brahmas there were, but it was enough to make it a massive noise. And so they lowered and started cowboy yelling at it when I say, get out, get out. And it turned and ran off. So immediately we broke camp, and they threw everything in the truck and just left. Those 2 men didn't say a word till we got back up to the ranch house. And my dad looked at Joe and said, "Are you okay?" And he goes, all Joe said was, "I hate those things." And so he obviously had dealt with them before. So Joe got out of the truck, and then, of course, I'm 4 years old. I'm going to start asking questions. What was that? Well, it's kind of like an ape, he said. I said, "There's monkeys in the woods? There's monkeys?" Well, not really. He was vague and stuff. So finally he pulled over when I asked enough questions. He figured it was time to talk. And I remember his eyes to this day. He turned and looked at me and started talking, and he had like massively steel blue eyes. And you could always tell on my dad when he was serious, you know, and he said, look, this is something out in the woods that's there. They don't typically mess with us, but it's out in the woods. And I said, well, is it a hobo? Because hobos were a thing back then. And no, it's kind of like an ape. And he said, we have to keep this quiet. He said, you can't even tell your mother. And he was military, so I understood secrets because everything was a secret to him. He worked in some high-level stuff. So, you know, what are you working on, Dad? Can't tell you. You know, then, so I understood. So he convinced me that I was going to be quiet about it. And I respected him enough, even at that age, that I knew to be quiet. And he said, I'll tell you about him one day. So, of course, over time, I'd ask, you know, what was that? You know, what? And so he would say stuff like, we're not going to talk about it right now. Ask me again next year. You know, he just avoided the subject. So years later, this was in the late 60s. Years later, we moved up to, after he retired, we moved up to Carbondale, Colorado, and Glenwood Springs area. And of course, he loved to hunt, and I was always loving to be right there with my dad. So I was about 9 at that time. 8, 9, well, yeah, I was 9. So it's 1973 in the winter. And we had a friend, my dad had a friend that we went and used his hunt camp way up in the high country. And of course they were going for elk also. So we were going for elk and deer. And we're finished hunting for the day, and we came back, and it was Mike, the friend, and his dad were already at the camp, and Dad and I had gotten real cold, so they had stuffed my feet with inside of gun cases to keep them warm, and they'd started a fire to warm me up. And that's when Mike said, you know, he looked and he's like, what is that? Well, on the next mountainside over, we could see something walking along, and it was big. It was one of your typical big, massive, hulking things, because we got the excuse me, we got the eyeglasses out, the scopes out, and we're looking at it. And I'll never forget when I looked at it, I said, I know what that is. And the look my dad gave me told me to shut my mouth right there. Because, you know, he cut his eyes, and I don't know, you know. Dad went, no, you don't. And we kept our mouth shut. So when the rest of the hunters came in for that camp, now the cool thing about this one was it was going from tree to tree, and it was peeling off pine bark, and it was eating. And I didn't realize what it was doing until years later. I learned that the layer underneath bark is nutritious, and this was eating those layers as part of its nutrition, just getting something in, I guess. And so it was going from, we watched it for quite a while and could see it was a typical, I would say that one was more in the range of Patty. It had the sagittal crest and the bigger bulk, so to speak. So when the rest of the hunters came to the camp, of course, Mike, you can't believe what we saw. And, you know, so he said, I think we saw Bigfoot. And the guys immediately started razzing him. You know, my dad's looking at me the whole time like, don't you say a word. don't you say a word. So I knew. And later that spring, I asked him, and he said we were fishing on the Royal Fork River, and we were sitting down, and I said, Dad, what are those things? And he finally opened up to me, and he said, look, they're an ape that's just like a man. He goes, I knew them as skunk apes. Now, he was born and raised in Florida, in the Panhandle in Marietta. So, yes, he had prior knowledge of him just being in the woods. And so he told me about him, and he said, and I don't think this was true. It's just what he used to settle my mind. Because we were still, he was retired, but we still were ingrained in secret. And he said the government knows about him, but they don't want us to talk about him. And like I said, I don't know if that's true. I think it might have been just something he said to keep me quiet. Because, seriously, in 1973, 1974, who wanted their kid running around town saying they had a Bigfoot, saw a Bigfoot, you're the crazy kid in town, because you really were. There were three things that that I was told not to believe in. In that era, we were told, Bigfoot was a hoax, ghosts were a hoax, and UFOs were a hoax. Well, 2 out of the 3 have been proven already, so I'm hoping for the trifecta with Bigfoot. And yes, it's going to happen one day. It just has to take time, I guess. But yeah, even with that, so if I saw a UFO, if I saw a ghost, I would have not supposed to see that stuff. So in the industry I'm in today, of course, ghosts are okay, and the UFOs now are, hey folks, it's real. Our government's saying, yeah, something's going on. They're not being truthful, but they're saying we had that whistleblower recently. So it's kind of nice that I've grouped those 3 together, and I haven't started talking about it until about a couple of years ago. I was listening to some podcast online, and it just hearing the stories upon stories made me realize that, yes, there is something out there, and it's okay to talk about it. Call me crazy. I'm at an age now where I don't care. You call me crazy, fine. I don't care. I know what I saw. And so the third encounter happened in the late 90s. I had moved to St. Augustine, Florida, and I had a cleaning business, and we worked at night. And one time when I was pulling up to where our house was, we lived on a couple acres and north of St. Augustine, so it was very wooded at the time. And a small creature runs in front of my car, and at first it's on all fours, and I'm thinking, is that a bear? A baby bear? No. Well, about halfway through the road, it stood up and ran on 2 feet across, and then jumped the ditch to the other side. And that was just we're talking a brief encounter that quick. And the first thing your mind does is try to figure out what it is. And first of all, our mind goes, did you actually see that? And you start thinking, and much like your story, you said, did you see that? You had somebody with you, which was great. And so when that happened, I started, I didn't even think to stop, slow down, look around. Mom or Dad's going to be around there anyway. But it was right around the corner from my property. So that kind of freaked me out and it took a while. And then you start going through what it wasn't. Was it a bear? Was it an alligator? I've never seen 2-foot, alligators walk on 2 feet. So you just start thinking, was it a monkey? Because there are some pockets of monkeys in Florida. but it wasn't. It was a baby Bigfoot. The fourth encounter happened up there. We spent COVID in Bull Shoals on the Missouri side in a little town called Pro-Tem. And there's one building in Pro-Tem. And as I used to say, it's so far back in the woods, I had to go towards town to hunt. I mean, it was at the end of the end of a road on a cove. It was out there. It was out in that area. It's 50 minutes to go to the pharmacy. So, you've been out there, you know how desolate that could be. And we went down to the lake one day, and I was doing a little fishing. This was spring of 2021. And I saw something out in the water across the cove. Now, I can't estimate how big this cove is. Probably in feet, it was probably 400 or 500 feet away. But I saw something in the water, and I started watching it, and it was coming up and down. And it wasn't coming up and down in any sequence. Like if it was a log, if a log is caught in a stream, in a water stream or something like that, it will bob on. The laws of physics will tell it bobs on time. This thing was not bobbing on time. It was moving around a little bit. And so I'm watching it. My wife's over at the other side, watching, playing with the dog and just sitting there enjoying the lake. And all of a sudden she goes, "Russ, is that a bird in the water?" And I said, "Well, if it's a bird, then we have floating ostriches." Because that's how big that thing, it was huge. And it was the head of it, but occasionally we'd see the shoulders come up. And the roundness of it really, I just couldn't comprehend what it was. And I immediately was like, well, let's talk about what it is. Is it a bear? No. Is it is it a person? No. Is it a diver? Is it no dive? Somebody said, well, it could have been a diver. Well, I don't know of any diver that has a head that big around. And so we watched it. I was watching across the lake too and watching it move. And it just moved around the cove until it went out of sight. And so we sat and talked about it. And I had just opened up to her maybe 6 months before that. And the funny thing is, the minute I moved there, we had a little half-acre spot, and we put a camper on it. And behind the camper was some woods, and a guy in the area that hunted a lot, he said, "Be careful back there. There's caves, and there's ravines, and you don't see them." So I had that just, that warning to be in that area. Anytime I was around those woods, it lit up on my, the back of my neck lit up. And in fact, when we first got there, I told her later, I said, it wouldn't surprise me if I saw a Bigfoot walk by the camp, because I just had that feeling. And the roundness really bothered me, the roundness of that head. So of course, I grew up till I lived in St. Louis from the time I was about 10 till 35 or so, or 30. And we had, in the 70s, we had stories of Momo, the Missouri monster. And I went back and looked at those stories and some of the images that people had put out. And one of the things they call Momo is Pumpkinhead. And because it has that massive round, it's probably just a mane, but it has a massive round head. And so are there different species? Yes, different types. In my mind, I believe there are from that. But yeah, so we saw an actual Momo and never got to see it come out of the water. But so I asked my friend that hunted in that area a lot, and I said, "Hey, have you ever seen anything strange in the woods?" Because he had been all over those woods. And he goes, I think of it this way. He goes, I don't go looking for the boogeyman, but when I see him, I just ignore him. Yeah. And I was like, well, that's the way he gets through it, you know? Yeah. Don't go looking for him, but if you see him, just, act like you didn't see him. And then we asked a neighbor one time, they'd been on that code for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, older neighbors. And I asked him, I said, have you ever seen anything odd? And they both snapped their head and looked at each other with eyes like, oh, he may have seen something. And they were like, well, sometimes, well, they were really like, we're not going to talk about it. So I dropped the subject. So that's my 4. And yeah, all different types, 3 different types actually, because the baby, the younglings speak or whatever. And this thing was small. It was not like a 3 foot. This thing was 2 feet, if that. And so it was a very young big. And of course, down in Florida, they call them skunk apes. And that's what my dad called was skunk apes. And I think, when you see some of the stuff that comes out of Florida, the Mayaca photos, that's a skunk ape for sure.
Russ, what an incredible story. And thank you for taking the time to share that with my audience. I know that's not an easy thing to talk about, but my hope is by talking about this kind of stuff, people will feel comfortable to come forward with their stories, because I know there's a lot of people out there that have had encounters and mysteries that maybe they're just afraid to talk about. And if that's you, email me at video@jscreativear.com. The whole reason I started this podcast was to give you a safe place to share your mysteries. So get a hold of me. I would love to have you on, because without you, this podcast would not be possible. We'll see you in the next episode. Peace.